Welcome back to Let's Talk Kashrus. Today I am privileged to be joined by Rabbi Dovid Heber, a Kashrus administrator at the Star K in Baltimore. How are you, Rabbi Heber?
Hashem, Shalom Aleichem. Nice
Such
to be here.
Such a to finally have you here on the program.
Hashem.
There are a lot of different topics to talk about, but we decided today to talk about something that's very relevant. It's something that most people deal with on a daily basis, and that is brochos as they relate to breakfast cereals. Give us a little primer on what we should know about why this topic could be somewhat complicated.
Sure. So there are many ingredients in many products. Cereals are complex because there's an array of ingredients that go into them. And you have items which are chamesh mine dagan, which would be typically a mezainis. And then you have ground up non-chamesh mine dagan, which would become a shahakol. Sometimes you have a mixture. Sometimes you need to know how much is in one product, and it's going to be a difference in afkamina, how much is in there. And for a consumer, sometimes it's impossible to know.
I was going to say, it wouldn't even help to look at the ingredient panel if you don't know how much of a certain ingredient is in the product.
Correct. Sometimes that's the case. And in fact, that's where kashrus agencies come in, because kashrus agencies have access to the factories. We have access. Technically, we don't usually get percentages of products because we don't, to make something kosher, even if it's a little bit, we don't give a hechsher on it. Right. Kashrus agencies are careful not to be samech habittel, certainly to give a hechsher on a product where there's tarfus in it, we won't give a hechsher. So percentages only come into play in a kashrus per se when it's something, chas v'shalom goes wrong. But typically we don't look at percentages, we don't need percentages. By brochos, sometimes that information is very important, and we ask as kashrus agencies, we find out that information when it's relevant to the recitation of the bracha.
And I will say also that typically, from what I've seen, while some Hamisha companies put the bracha on the product, which is very helpful, I imagine that large companies like Post and General Mills and Kellogg's are probably not so keen on putting the bracha on.
Correct, because then people are going to ask, what's the Hebrew writing?
What is it?
Baruch Hashem, they put the hechsher on.
Exactly, I was going to say, tafastem rubaloi tafasta, at least
exactly.
They do what they do, and we're grateful for that.
Exactly, we do take achrayas. A lot of agencies, though, do take achrayas for what bracha is said. At Star K, where I'm zeicha to work. So if a company wants to put a bracha, and I think most agencies are like this also, where if a company wants to put a bracha on the label, it has to run through our Ramesh Heinemann Shlita first. He would have to agree to that. And if someone wants to put on, let's say they want to put mezainis on a product that's hamaitzi, let's say the famous, the mezainis rolls,
right,
where with mezainis rolls, which Rabbi Heinemann and Rebelski's were very makbid that those typical mezainis rolls are really hamaitzi. We're talking about where it looks like bread and tastes like bread and acts like bread. It's hamaitzi. So they were makbid, both the Star K and Rebelski was makbid in the OU, that they can't write mezainis if it's not. In other words, because people look at it and think, oh, the hechsher, the paiskim at this agency agree with the psak on the label. So some items like the Hamisha companies that are making pizza or whatever will have the ability to write it, but the national companies are not going to let the mezainis hadama on the box.
So getting back to cereals, give us some examples of specific cereals that would be typically mezainis, hadama, shahakol, and some guidelines.
Sure. Okay. So let's start with chamesh mine dagan. Chamesh mine dagan are the 5 grains. So you have wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt that are the 5 grains. Those chamesh mine dagan, of course, if they become bread, are hamaitzi. And if you make them into an item that's not a hamaitzi, like a maisa kadera, or you grind it up into flour and make an item, a cake would be, possible a kistin would be mezainis. You make it into a cereal, so now that cereal is going to be mezainis. Cheerios is a classic example. Cheerios are oat flour that's ground up, and now they mix it and they put it through the various equipment that's going to heat it up and dry it and so on, and now it becomes a mezainis. So Cheerios, regular Cheerios, is pashat a mezainis cereal. Life cereal, chamesh mine dagan, those are very straightforward. Next case, if you have rice, a rice cereal, that's, let's say, you grind up the rice and make it into rice flour, so then that's also going to be mezainis, but in a fashis. It takes on the properties of the rice, and therefore it's a mezainis and b'nefashos. Let's say rice checks, for example, would be a mezainis. Rice Krispies also are mezainis. That gets to a whole other shaila. Lamaisa, Rav Heinemann says to make a mezainis on Rice Krispies. I think many poskim hold like that. There are some that will make hadama. That's more of a lumdish shaila of how much goes on, which actually is also part of the shaila of how they make it exactly this way or that way. And as we'll see later.
Now, just to ask you, if I see on an ingredient panel, if I see one of the chamishas minei dagan as the first ingredient, could I assume that it's mezainis?
Not necessarily, because if you have, let's say, chamesh minei dagan that has not been processed, let's say kashi cereal. Kashi cereal is a grain, chamesh minei dagan, and it's puffed without, they don't remove the bran from it. So pretty much l'chol hadeis, kashi is going to be hadama, because it's hakaisis chita. If you take wheat, and this is if you took wheat out of the field, like the farmer from Kansas, that has the wheat in his mouth,
and he's eating it
as
raw,
is,
what we call
raw, then it's going to be a hadama. Even if you toast it to a certain extent, and it doesn't become a ma'aseh kedera, it retains its hadama status. So if you have certain grain cereals that are, kashi is the best example. Once you start processing it more, this is where the Rubik's Cube of shilas come up. Is this enough? Is this not enough? There's a whole machlokes about vuch in the paiskim about puffed wheat, golden crisp. This is already discussed. Ramosha speaks about that cereal. But before we get into the lumdus, let's just say that if you look at the label and it's a processed item that's been ground into a flour, the grain is no longer nicker, then it's going to be a mezainis. If the first ingredient, so it's oats or wheat, are typically the cereals that are going to have ground up, it's going to become a mezainis, and then you're good to go. It's 100% mezainis. Now, if, however, so that's the second category. The third is if you take a non-chameshes minei dagan item, like corn. Corn is very common. You grind it up. It's a corn as is a hadama. If you grind it up, let's say kick cereal, for example, is ground up corn and sugar. It's basically shahakals. The hadama is no longer nicker. Then the bracha is going to be a shahakal. Where it gets tricky is if you have a ground cereal that, is it nicker or is it not nicker? Is it enough processed? Is it not enough processed? And this is where you get into chilukades amongst the paiskim, exactly what constitutes. But those are the basic, l'chol hades. You grind wheat, it's a mezainis. You grind a non-chamesh minei dagan, it's going to be a shahakal. You grind rice, it's going to be a mezainis and a b'nefashos.
So I remember over the years, different types of cornflakes. Some were hadama and some were shahakal. Tell us why.
Correct. Okay. So corn flakes are made two different ways. One way to make it is by taking the corn, and the way corn starts, corn flakes, if you make it this way, this is the way Kellogg's makes it, is they take a corn grit, and think of a piece of popcorn, right? You open a bag of popcorn, you have these grits. And let's say it's maybe a little smaller than a corn grit, it's probably about the same size. Then they go ahead and they soften it, and they run it through rollers. Then they toast it. So that's going to be a hadama. Rav Moshe already in the Torah of Hira in the early 70s was asked to Shaila. I think it's reprinted in the Gus Moshe also. And he paskined that it's hadama. Now this is a little bit of lumdus, because there were other svarim that spoke about this. The Reb Talushkin in the Sefer HaMikvos, he writes, he has a whole, and he lived long before Reb Moshe's Psak, I believe, and why is it back of Mikvos? He put a few shticklich in the back, right? And in there he speaks about the bracha on cornflakes. Al Kapanim, Reb Moshe wrote clearly two very important piskei dinim for Kellogg's cornflakes, and that is, number one, that's considered nicker, right? And popcorn, both items, because if you take corn and you eat it as is, corn on the cob, it's going to be a hadama. If you grind it up, as we said, and you make a kick cereal out of it, it's going to be a shahakal. Reb Moshe was asked, but cornflakes is flattened. If I want to give a mushal, if you want to do this at house, don't try this at home. But if you took cornflakes, you took popcorn and you softened it, and then you took your baking pans, right, and you put these corn grits in between the baking pans and you drove over it, okay, and then you took it and put it in the oven, you'd have cornflakes. Because you flattened it out.
So it's the actual grit.
It's the actual grit. So Reb Moshe, right, in the Gus Moshe, that's a hadama. That's not called losing its surah. You just stretched it. Popcorn also. Popcorn was puffed. If you showed someone popcorn that didn't know what popcorn was, they would not know it's from corn. So Ramesh, no, it's still nicker because you stretched it in a way, and it retains its bracha. Now that's how Kellogg's does it. Other companies, for example, Kemach cornflakes. Right. Kemach is made in a factory where they make it from what's called corn, not the grit, but it's pellets. What they do is it's really more uniform. What happens is they have corn flour that are made into pellets. Those pellets look like the original corn grit, but they're pellets. So those have lost their tsura. They're no longer, because they're not corn flour. They do the same process, basically, and that is they soften it and they roll it, and you get a cornflake. Now the consumer buys this brand or buys that brand.
It looks similar.
But Lamaisa, one's Adama and one is a Shahakal, which is the beauty of Torah is that you could have two items that look the same, and to the consumer they're the same, but yet you got to this, and they look the same, and they almost, maybe taste the same. Obviously, maybe there's, I don't know if exactly the same, but you can't really tell the difference. For many years, I was wondering, is there a way the consumer to tell this? Because we publish, and Starkey has a list, a brochos list, which we publish for, we redo it every so often, but in there, we write this cornflakes is Hadama and this cornflakes is Shakal. What if you're a consumer and you don't have that, you don't have that idea, you don't know this brand, and it's not on the list, so what do you do? So I spoke to many mumchim over the years, and finally there was a mumcha who told me that if you look at the perimeter of the cornflake, in the cornflakes that are made, let's say by Kellogg's, you'll see it's much more jagged, because they're taking a natural grit. And natural grits are not uniform. They're the way
that could be so neat.
Exactly. So it's more jaggedy, the peripheral part. But if you look at a cornflake that's made from the corn pellet, those are made uniform. So now that's going to be much smoother. It's not smooth like a shchita knife, right?
Right.
It would but it's lemaisa much smoother, the perimeter.
And you're saying also the flakes may be more uniform in general, or not necessarily?
The size, I think, again, the Kellogg's, I'm not sure if the size is going to be different, but the perimeter is going to be jagged in the Hadama, and if it's more uniform, meaning it's much straighter and smoother, then it's going to be Shahakal because it was from a corn grit.
I just want to go back to something you said before about an interesting nakuda regarding bishalakim that you said you saw in the factory.
Correct. Yes. So we asked, some people have a taina, maybe Rice Krispies and Crispix should be a problem with bishalakim because rice is oil al shulchan malachim, and therefore, and it's ena nechok b'shukai, which means it's not eaten raw, and it's oil al shulchan malachim. They serve a chasana, right? It's a chasana like Maimer. They had rice, right? So it's oil al shulchan malachim. So maybe there's a bishalakim problem.
That might depend on if you go bust at a min or you go bust at a product also, right?
Correct. So but here, so if you look at assuming
that the min is oil shulchan malachim,
so now you have the shayla. But Lamaisa, this product has to be roy to be oil shulchan malachim as it is. Lamaisa, we take, and it's rice. In other words, they cook it up. It's heated. Right. So behind him tasted it in that state before it was dried, and he says, this is not oil shulchan malachim. It might not be oil shulchan anybody because when they make it, it's oil shulchan. They make it in a way that's going to be roy. The ingredients they add are so that the finished product, when it's toasted, is going to taste good. It's not meant to be served for supper.
I see.
At your table.
So they're cooking the rice in a different fashion.
Correct, and it's cooked in an oifen that is never oil shulchan malachim because I don't know if it tastes bad. Could you bring it home? Maybe edible, but it's certainly not.
So if Heinemann held that because of that, there's no problem with bishalakim.
Correct, exactly, right.
Very interesting. Thank you for this fascinating conversation, this educational primer on cereals.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.